Welcome everybody to today's seminar. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Gaetan Masson. Gaetan is from Belgium, as you will hear shortly from his accent. Gaetan is the task leader in an International Energy Agency Task 1, the International Energy Agency Task 1, which is on strategy, communication and outreach. This is the International Energy Agency program on PV and power systems, and it's all about increasing penetration of solar around the world. And Gaetan leads this task, which has representation from 28 countries, providing their feedback and information, statistics, data on PV markets in their country, and that's amalgamated into international reports. They hold a meeting twice a year. We've had the pleasure of hosting that meeting for the last few days, and you will see that there's a representation from around the world in the room. And I will hand over now to Gaetan to tell you a little bit about the PV market and industry development around the world in the last few years and future forecasts. Thank you, Gaetan.
Thank you, Renati. Well, it's nice that you have introduced me as coming from Belgium. I'm also coming from France, which explains the strange accent I could have in English. You could have bet. I'm not going to talk too much about what we are doing, and if you're interested, since we have a little less time than initially foreseen, the IEA-PVPS, as it was explained nicely by Renati, is focusing on photovoltaics for now more than 23 years, and it has accompanied the development of the market in the industry with, I would say, an acute level of expertise on the reason why the PV market is developing or not developing in some countries. I'm going to start with some, I would say, insights on PV market development globally, what has happened in the last years and what could happen in the future. Then I will discuss about PV prices and technology with a slightly different view than the one that many people are presenting in general. I will say a word about the most competitive tenders for PV that we have seen recently, about the concept of competitiveness for PV, and this could take me during more than a day, so I will go pretty fast on that. And if we have enough time, I will present a 100% renewable energy study that was done for the Asia-Pacific study by European University recently. And I will finish, if I have time again, by some elements on self-consumption. But I would like to give you some opportunity at the end to ask questions, so I will not spend too much time. And as you can see, I haven't put cartoons in French, just in English, so fortunately it's understandable. I love in general presenting the PV market with that nice figure, looking 15 years in the past, where basically PV was nowhere. It was considered as a nice niche technology for space application and rural electrification. And from 2017, 2018, the market really started thanks to the political commitment in a certain number of countries, mainly in Europe, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy and in others, that led to the incredible development that we have seen in the last years. And in 2015, we installed in the world a bit more than 50 gigawatts. I like to say 50,000 megawatts because it puts the number into perspective. 50 gigawatts, we will install most probably this year a bit more than 60 or 65 gigawatts minimum, perhaps even more than that. It means that basically the market has been multiplied by a factor of 50 in a bit more than 10 years, and the installed capacity in the world that will reach at the end of this year almost 300 gigawatts has been multiplied by much more than that. And this is something that has not been understood well in many regions of the world until recently by policymakers. When we're discussing about energy in general, people have the tendency to look every 10 years at numbers. It takes 10 to 20 years to build a nuclear power plant. It takes 1 year to build a large PV power plant. We have, in the PV sector, caused a major breakthrough and a major change in the way our policymakers are looking at energy. And 10 years in the past, PV was nowhere. So someone who would look at PV after having spent 10 years in the bush would be extremely surprised of the importance that this technology is taken. I will not spend too much time about that. I don't think that the confidence in numbers is something important, but it also comes from the fact that many national institutions haven't understood yet how to record or to register PV installations. And it comes from the fact that they have simply not understood what was happening. And it takes a lot of time to put in place new regulations, which explains that in many regions of the world, in many countries, it's almost impossible to know what has been installed, or we have to look at import and exports of components. If we're looking at the countries that are dominating the PV market these days, there is one country that has taken the lead 2 years ago and will not probably abandon it. It's China, which is now the first country in terms of annual installations. And they've already installed in the first months of 2016 more than 22 gigawatts, so much more than what they installed in 1 year last year. It's something rather logical given the number of inhabitants in the country. They are followed by Japan, the US, and then a certain number of other countries, some European countries, UK, Germany, France, but also other markets which are developing rather well, and Australia is in the top 10 in terms of total installed capacity, but also in terms of annual markets. Something interesting when you're looking at these numbers, it's the discrepancy between the leaders and the markets in the top 10. If we are looking at the top 20, we start to have installations level that are much lower than what we can see here. But yeah, if I'm telling you 50 gigawatt, it's extremely difficult to figure out what that means. So I prefer this one that shows the penetration of PV in the electricity consumption in a certain number of countries in the world. I should have adapted it because now we have one country where the penetration is higher than 12%, and it has been reached in only 1 year. It's Honduras in Latin America. But below we have a certain number of well-known countries where the PV penetration has increased significantly, and it happened in all these countries in less than 5 years. Something that is even more interesting is that you can roughly multiply these numbers by 2, and then you have the PV penetration in the peak electricity demand. And in many countries, when you look at the peak electricity demand, we are not talking about 2, 3, 4% of penetration, we're talking about levels close to 10%. It's also the case in Japan or in Spain during summertime. When we're talking about Italy or Germany, we are higher than 15%. Now, just to discuss a little bit about markets, it's also these 10 markets that are making the global PV market. So which means that PV hasn't spread yet in all the markets where it could develop in the future. This is something that will, in my opinion, change in the coming years. But it means it's a market that is still concentrated in countries that have understood the potential of PV and that have decided through ad hoc regulatory frameworks to develop PV. And this is something that hasn't evolved significantly in the last years. We still have one big market, a certain number of medium-sized markets, and then many, many, many smaller-sized markets. Now we have PV installed at a low level in something like 170 or 180 countries out of 200 in the world. If we look at what can happen in the coming years, and I will not spend too much time in explaining the rationale behind the forecast, everyone expects that the PV market is going to grow. The question is how fast and where. And it's always the same thing. Energy is not something that can be compared to a mobile phone. You're not buying a PV panel to put it on your roof in the same way that you're buying a mobile phone. I hope it will happen one day. But so far, it works because of existing policies. And that's what I'm calling the policy triangle. It's a difference between a business-as-usual market, where countries are supporting the development of PV, but no more than that, and a more optimistic market development, which is what I believe we will experience in the coming years. Let's say a PV market development in the world where many countries will step in that market and start to develop PV as a reasonable and sound power generation source. And I will not spend too much time on that. Something that is interesting is when we're talking about PV, we should talk about two different markets. Distributed PV market, a market for prosumers. I want to generate a part of my own electricity in the residential segment, in the commercial, in the industrial segment. I have a building, I'm consuming electricity, I want to reduce my bill, I'm putting PV on my roof. This is a very specific market, which can to a certain extent be associated to the concept of energy efficiency. The impact at the end is the same. I'm simply consuming less electricity coming from outside. And on the other side, we have what we're calling utility scale or large-scale PV applications. The largest in the world now that is planned is a 2 gigawatt or 2 gigawatt of PV. It starts to represent a certain number of square kilometers. But the idea is simply to compete with traditional electricity generation and to produce electricity, to inject it into the grid. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but basically you can see that for prosumers, the idea of being competitive for PV will be linked to the electricity price that I'm paying, so the retail electricity prices, while for producers it will be the price of generation, so the wholesale electricity prices in countries where there is a functioning electricity market. And when you look at these two set of market segments, they evolved over time. And something is interesting is that basically a very large part of the market globally now is dominated by these very large scale applications. They represented more than 60% of the market last year, and in my opinion, it's going to continue growing. And if we look 15 years in the past, and of course it's a normalized figure, it's not absolute values, the off-grid market, so PV used for rural electrification, not connected to the grid, was a significant part of the market, let's say close to 20% 15 years ago. Now it represents barely 0.5%, perhaps in the best case 1% of the market. And it's an interesting shift. So PV has shifted from off-grid application to mainstream power generation in only 15 years. This is something that we have never seen in the past for other electricity sources. Now, I was saying that the market was dominated by utility scale applications, and indeed, most probably, it's going to continue in the coming years. Why? For something that is rather simple to explain to people who have tried in Australia to install a PV system, you need a specific regulation to become a prosumer. So you need the right to consume electricity, you need the right to export PV electricity into the grid, and we can see that in emerging countries, this is something that is extremely difficult to put in place, very often because there are no or little regulation for the electricity sector, and very often one major utility controlling electricity generation and distribution in the country. And so I think that in the coming years we will see more and more large-scale utility plants developing, and that it will be more complex to see the distributed PV market developing. And of course, it's not happening in the same way region by region. And we have the Middle East and Africa, where basically almost no installations are distributed. And we have Europe on the other side, where distributed PV applications still represented at the end of last year 50% of installations. If we're looking at the rest of the world, it's between these two extremes. And then you will tell me, is PV competitive or not? I'm not going to answer the question. I will present you something much more interesting, which are the main incentives that in 2015 led to PV development in the world. And I will simplify the figure, and I will tell you that 94% of the market was driven by financial incentives. Whoever is paying them, feed-in tariffs, tax breaks, green certificates, whatever, or incentivized net metering or incentivized self-consumption. It means that basically only 6% of the PV market is purely competitive or has been generated by competitive tenders in 2015. For PV lovers, and I'm one of them, can tell you that it's exactly the same for the traditional energy sector, that power generation is almost always incentivized. Now, I would like to be a little bit more technical and look at prices and technology. I really love that one, but there are some people who don't appreciate it, especially in Saudi Arabia. I don't know why. Alors, PV is based, I don't have to explain it to you, I think, on semiconductors, and the concept of the learning curve, which is an empirical concept, shows that basically each time I'm doubling the installed capacity of PV, my production cost or the prices, and I will show you here the prices, are supposed to go down by a factor that remains roughly stable over time. When we are taking this very conventional way of representing the evolution of PV module prices over time, it's 21%. It means that the price is supposed to go down by 21% each time that the installed capacity doubles. That's the traditional learning curve. Of course, when you look at the learning curve, you see that it's more a curve than a line. And many strange things happened in the last years. You know that many countries around the world have concluded that China was dumping PV modules. Yeah, dumping, so it means they are losing money. But on the contrary, when I'm looking at the balance sheet of most tier 1 Chinese companies, they are earning money. So if they're earning money, it means that they are not selling below the price. So what happens? And that's something extremely interesting, and I think we have changed completely. I will not spend too much time on that slide, but I think we have changed. The world has changed in the last years, and one of the things that has changed is the way how we produce PV modules compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And so you have seen the hypothesis. I will not go too much in detail. I've decided to consider the learning curve in a totally different perspective. And being an engineer, I love numbers. And so I asked myself, okay, everyone is looking at the learning curve, is taking points dating back in the past from 1970 when we were paying almost $100 per watt a PV module. And the blue points that you see here correspond to the moment where basically PV was extremely expensive, and it ended at the moment where we had 2 gigawatt of cumulative capacity. 2 gigawatt of cumulative capacity, we will be at the end of this year at 300 gigawatt of cumulative capacity. So basically it represents a bit less than 1% of the total installed capacity. And then the PV market started, and the level of industrialization also increased. So for small companies manufacturing PV systems in Europe, in Japan, in the US, we went into an industrial era. And the first thing that happened was basically a stabilization of prices caused mainly by a shortage of polysilicon that lasted in terms of total installed capacity from 2 gigawatt to 10 gigawatt. 10 gigawatt again compared to 300 gigawatts. These are the orange dots. And then China entered in the game and prices went down. Not only China, actually. A lot of countries entered into the game, and the size of manufacturing plants increased dramatically. If we look back in the past, in 2008, 2009, a factory manufacturing 100, 200 megawatt of PV modules a year was common. Now the largest are manufacturing more than 5 gigawatt a year. We have changed completely the face of the PV industry, and the gray dots that you can see here represents the decrease of PV module prices over time. And if I'm looking at these ones, they represent 97% of the installed module in the world. 97%. As an engineer, if someone told me that the 3 or the percent are influencing radically the learning curve, I will say simply, there is simply some points that you should take out of your calculation, and you should consider the 97 remaining percent. And what's happening for the time being in terms of price decrease on the market, but also cost decrease, the tendency to validate the fact that we do not have a 20% learning curve, but we have a learning curve in between 30 and 37%. So if we have a learning curve between 30 and 37% instead of 20, it changes things dramatically for the PV industry. It means that basically we can expect that the price of PV module is going to decline further in the coming years than what we expected. And, well, that's what happens. If you looked, I haven't updated that slide I made 1 month ago, but it's not anymore $0.38 per watt peak for the cheapest module that you can buy on the market. And I know someone in the room who will start to talk about average selling price. Where is Arnulf? But basically, we are now down to $0.35 per watt peak on the spot market. It means, because these prices are real and used for the competitive tenders that I will mention in a couple of minutes, it means that basically the price of PV modules has declined faster than what we could have foreseen with a 21% learning curve, and tries to validate the idea that prices are going down faster. And discussing with a certain number of Chinese companies, or Korean companies that I will not mention, they are indeed saying that basically all the assumptions that we were using in terms of cost of equipment, for instance, should be totally abandoned. And that indeed we are on a totally different paradigm with regards to price decline. And if we're looking at the cost roadmap from the most competitive companies, and I've taken the one from Jinko, and this has to be taken as a commercial announcement, so we can discuss about what it really means in the reality. But they have announced $0.37 per watt peak current production cost, Q3 2016, 0.29 in a bit more than 1 year from now, and 0.25 in 2020. It has been announced by First Solar as well. In my opinion, not so many companies are able to follow such a rapid decline in production costs and therefore to sell at extremely low prices, but at least some companies are able to do it and are starting to advertise it. So basically, and that's not a conclusion, but indeed 97% of the production, I hope that this has convinced you that when you're doing math, sometimes or stats, it's good to take the points that have nothing to see with the latest one out of the calculation. And then the consequences are radically different in terms of perspectives of price decline for the PV industry, much more positive than what we could have expected. As I was saying, we will approach the 300 gigawatt at the end of this year. Indeed, we are, in terms of spot price on the market, and many companies are confirming that you can buy PV modules for orders around 1 megawatt for $0.35 per watt peak, traditional polycrystalline modules at around 16% of efficiency at that price. It means that we are on the most ambitious 37% learning curve. I think it's time to look at the PV market and industry in a totally different way. Something important that has played a major role, it's the economies of scale, and many companies are trying to reach now 10 gigawatt of shipments every year. We'll see which company will be able to reach 10 gigawatt in the 2 or 3 coming years, but many are trying to reach it. Between 1 gigawatt and 10 gigawatt, there is a major difference in production costs, just due to economies of scale with exactly the same technology, the same financing costs and other things. So the companies that are trying to increase shipments will have, in any case, a major competitive advantage in the coming years. Now, this is a figure that has been taken from the ITR PV roadmap, the 7th ITR PV roadmap, that shows their expectation about technology development. I will not spend too much time on that. There is something extremely interesting, is that they are only considering crystalline silicon. They never do assumptions for thin film technologies. And one of the reasons is perhaps the following one. In gray, you can see the traditional crystalline silicon learning curve. And if you plot cadmium telluride cost and prices, because it's also interesting, and CIGS or CIS cost and prices, you can see two very, very interesting things, but with caution, because we are here, we're talking about a few years and some gigawatts of cumulative production capacities. basically, for cadmium telluride, we have a learning curve in between 16 and 20%. 16% it's a Trina Solar calculation, 20% it's a calculation that we have done ourselves. Same thing for CIGS and CIS, but here with extremely low numbers, 8 to 10%. Many people in the CIS, CIGS industry are telling me that it's not representative because they haven't yet exploited the possibilities of economies of scale, and the market remains too small, but to a certain extent it raises question about the ability of thin film to compete in the coming years with the continuously decreasing price of traditional crystalline silicon technology. Now, after some math, back a little bit to the reality of the market. If we believe that the market is going to develop between these boundaries, it means which are the production capacities then we need. And so I'm happy to have in the room my friend Izumi, who provided these numbers, these estimated numbers about production capacities in the world at the end of 2015. Something that you can see immediately is that basically if we had a market around 50 gigawatts and production capacities around 70 gigawatts or 77 gigawatts for modules and cells, and if we expect that the market this year could be above 65 gigawatts, basically we should be extremely close without any additional production capacities that could have been added. We should be extremely close to the maximum that we could produce, but it's not the case, and I will pass that one. We have installed in almost all places in the world much more gigawatts at all levels of the value chain than what the market can absorb. And then we are again in a nice situation of overcapacity. Trina Solar announced it in the beginning of 2016. Few companies and observers believed in it, but when you add 20 or 30 gigawatts of module production capacity in 1 year, while the existing production capacities could have been sufficient to feed the market, indeed at a certain moment what happens is that the prices are going down, and the prices are going down for the time being. So basically the conclusion is quite simple. The industry has a tendency to go much faster than the market, and it kills itself its ability to make profits. Now, I will try to go fast on the rest because otherwise you will have no time for questions. Something very interesting is the extremely competitive tenders that we have seen in the PV industry in the last months. The most competitive one that has been announced recently, even if we can discuss about the details, happened in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, but it's not the only one, and it was at $2.6 per kilowatt hour. US dollar cents, excuse me, per kilowatt hour, 2.6 US dollar. It was 20 years ago. It means that today, and it's a figure that has been compiled by the IEA, showing the difference in the decrease of cost for solar and wind for extremely competitive tenders, and the decline of cost for solar ones. It's much more important, and PV is now more competitive than wind in many locations where both technologies are put in competition, and especially in the sunniest countries. But basically 2.6 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour in the Middle East. It means probably 4 cents in Australia, 5 to 6 or 7 cents in Europe. So we are coming to prices that are extremely close or already below the wholesale electricity prices. So is 3 cents per kilowatt hour realistic? A simple LCOE calculation shows that basically you can do it with 0.8 US dollar per watt peak system price, and everyone knows that it's feasible for the time being, especially with modules below 0.4. With a reasonable OPEX, sorry to keep euro, but you can translate easily into Australian dollars multiplying by 1.5, so around 20, 22 Australian dollars per kilowatt, and a very low cost of capital. That's absolutely necessary, and we can discuss later if you want whether it's feasible or not. And the last one that I like most, we need to keep the degradation below 1%. And 0.5% is something acceptable. When we approach 1%, it becomes extremely difficult to stay in the $3 per kilowatt peak range. If we go above 1%, you can say goodbye to such low LCOE, so which means that the question of quality remains essential. I will not spend too much time about that, just to say that in the LCOE calculation today, the cost of PV system is now relatively marginal. The OPEX is almost at the same level, and the costs, the question of quality and the cost of financing are amongst the most important drivers. Now, and I will just accelerate on that, PV will be competitive in any case in the coming years, based on the current component costs, but also the expected decline in the coming years. I will not spend too much time about that. I could send you the complete presentation if you want, because I wanted to spend some seconds on something more interesting. Just showing you that in Europe, which is not the continent with the highest irradiation in the world, basically we have already reached competitiveness. It's called parity. It's not grid parity, it's real competitiveness for PV in almost all segments in a certain number of countries, and before 2030, in all cases, competitiveness will be reached in almost all European countries if we can ensure a sufficiently low cost of capital. Then, I wanted to spend some time on that. It's something that has been extracted from a very, very, very long presentation from Christian Breyer. Christian Breyer is a former market expert from Anwa Q-Cells who moved to a university in Finland, where he is one of the leaders in terms of modeling 100% renewable energy scenarios in the entire world. I will not spend too much time on the assumptions. What he considers in general is that already today, for new installations, in many countries, PV is less costly in terms of LCOE, so electricity cost generation, than almost all other technologies, nuclear of course, but also gas, and to a certain extent coal, if coal would be obliged to pay for the CO2 emission that they emit. And looking at the Asia-Pacific region, he looked at what was the current electricity mix and how it could be replaced by wind and PV at the horizon 2030, so not 2050 or even later. And he reached a very interesting conclusion, is that, excuse me, that 100% renewables could be feasible in the region with the necessary interconnections. And I will not spend too much time on numbers. There is one that I like most, if you look at the assumptions, is that the assumptions for CapEx in a certain number of PV sectors will be reached well before 2030. So which means that he was, to a certain extent, a little bit conservative. And he considered a certain number of existing technologies, though there is nothing that doesn't exist for the time being, in order to continue providing the same level of power quality that we have for the time being. And, going a bit fast, he reached the conclusion and that basically we could produce electricity during the year in the Asia-Pacific region for a cost of electricity around $6 per kilowatt hour with a 100% renewable energy power mix. And one thing that for me is extremely interesting is that this cost is only slightly higher than the cost that we have for the time being with the current electricity mix. And it's much lower than what we could have if we had to replace the current electricity mix. I love that one because it shows wind and PV loads, PV and wind, production profiles in the region. You have PV on one side, and you can see that basically in the Asia-Pacific region, it's rather stable throughout the year. And wind that is much more unpredictable, but that offers roughly during the year a rather similar pattern at all times of the day. Of course, PV is not producing during the night, or at least not alone. And he matched that with the existing and future load profiles in the region for all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region. I will not spend too much time on that. And the conclusion, as I was saying, is that the average LCOE in the region would be a bit more than 6 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. Here in the calculation, it's 6.7 euro, 6.7 euro cents per kilowatt hour. So you can do the calculation yourself. You see the numbers for Australia that are below that are below 5 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. I'm sure he will be extremely interested to present you the final results. Now, I have 3 remaining minutes, so I would like to spend these 3 remaining minutes, and I'm sorry for going a bit fast, on self-consumption, because I continue to believe that even if in the 5 coming years the PV market is going to develop mainly in the utility scale segment, at a certain moment prosumers will ensure a large part of PV development, and it will be feasible only, and I'm coming back to this slide that I've shown you, only with the right policy measures in place. Net metering, I've put it in red because in my opinion it's a dead concept, but self-consumption plus market price plus in some case a feed-in tariff or a feed-in premium for the exported electricity to the grid is the system that's going to develop, the regulatory framework that has to be put in place. Just to be sure, I have just too many slides, so you will have the pleasure, if you want to read my slides, to look at them. But basically, and I think that's probably the most important one, what will make PV competitive for prosumers when all financial incentives are abandoned? It's basically, it says that I have to produce electricity, including my capex cost and my maintenance cost, for lower than what I can gain from my system. So the savings on my electricity bill on one side and the sales of excess PV electricity exported to the grid. If the green part is positive, then PV is competitive. And that's something that's going to happen at a certain moment. I finished my slide at 2 a.m. yesterday, so I haven't checked really whether it was time compatible. So close your eyes and reopen it when I will be at the right place, which means at the end, the last slide. I'll tell you when you can up. Yeah, okay. Almost finished. About self-consumption, one thing that we have done within the IEA-PVPS group of people represented here is trying to standardize the way to look at self-consumption net metering business models by trying to define precisely what it means. I will not go in depth. And it comes always to the same conclusion. You have to regulate the way how you can save electricity from your electricity bill and provide the remuneration for the electricity that is injected into the grid. All the rest is non-interesting. If you are interested in the report, you can compare the different kind of existing policies from net billing, net metering, self-consumption with premium, self-consumption with constraints and other things. And that's the one that in general kills everyone in the audience. It just shows that indeed it's very complex to put in place a reasonable policy framework for self-consumption. So I'm not, and I had no intention to explain you in detail what is behind. Much more to finish by saying, I have no doubt that PV is going to be competitive much sooner than what many people expected, even in the PV industry. So it means that basically we will be able in a large part of the world before 2025, without any doubt before 2020, to produce electricity from PV at a competitive level much sooner than expected. and in most probably 90% of the world's surface. I have one Swedish and one Norwegian friend in the room. I have no doubt that in Sweden it will be reached before. In Norway it's going to be more complicated. But it's always nice to advertise PV. The problem is that electricity markets are totally unable for the time being to remunerate renewable electricities such as wind and PV. So there is a major transformation of the current electricity markets in Europe, in the US, in Australia, in other places in the world, if we want to accommodate high shares of variable renewable energies. And then there is the question of how to get rid of financial incentives, and especially how to protect people who have invested in the past. And that's something that is absolutely not guaranteed for the time being. And as long as we will have crazy policymakers, it will be complicated. I've said nothing about Australia. No? I've just spoken in general. And then there is a very interesting debate. I hope that I tried to convince you that China hasn't really dumped PV modules, but that China find an extremely interesting way to produce cheaper than the other ones. And the proof is that one of the most competitive producer for PV now in terms of production cost is not Chinese, but Korean. So which means that to a certain extent we have to ask ourselves the question, do we want to produce locally or do we want to install cheap PV? And that's something that will be extremely important in the coming years. But I think that the most important thing is still the quality. If you remember my slides about the 3 cents calculation that we have seen in the Middle East, 3 cents is feasible with a low degradation level. If I'm losing 1% or 2% of electricity production every year due to bad quality, I will never be able to be competitive. And that's something that everyone forgets very often. And it relates at the end to one simple thing. It's the cost of financing. PV will become the most important source of electricity in the world in the coming years if we are able to finance it at a very cheap cost, which means that PV installation must be risk-free, and risk-free from political risk, but also from technical risk. And I believe that the next step in evolution, I love that one, will be PV. And there's one that I love as well. I think it's time to spill, but perhaps not what we used to spill in the past. Thank you for your attention. And I made it before 1.
Thank you very much, Gaetan, for taking us through that, for taking us through the slides. Happy to take questions from the floor. Gaetan clearly has been hosting a workshop for the last 2.5 days and pulling these slides together, although clearly he's done it before. So the stories, yeah, and I was fascinated by your learning curve analysis.
Me too.
It would be good to do the same analysis on the competitive tenders, because it looks like that there's a step change going on there as well.
It would be extremely interesting to look at what's exactly behind the tenders. And the tenders I've seen recently have one characteristic in common. It's an extremely low cost of capital that comes from a high ratio of debt, very often higher than 80, even 85%, with debt at 3-4%, and a very little part of equity. And there is a big question whether this is sustainable from a financial point of view. In my opinion, not. But some countries which have a tendency to support their energy system in the Middle East have decided to go that way, but also in Latin America. So perhaps is it something that will spread in the future?
So, any other questions on the floor?
Yep. Thank you for that. With the price reduction learning curves, you were saying that in recent times it's been a lot faster than the average, but this is based on the selling price, and then later in a few slides you talked about how the market forces, essentially too much competition, is also driving down the prices, again the selling prices. So how much of this reduction in learning curve is actually genuine cost savings, and how much is actually market forces just kind of skewing the numbers?
I think on the short term, what we see for the time being, so the rapid price decline that we see for now 6 months, we have lost almost 20%. It's market forces. But on the medium term, it's basically savings on production cost. Because what we have seen in 2011, 2012, 2013, when the price went down very fast, is that many companies started to lose money. But in the 3 following years, let's say from mid-2013 to 2015, most of the companies started to earn money again, while the price were continuing to go down. So it means, in my opinion, the way or the costs are evolving are proceeding by steps. And what we see for the time being is more market dynamics that will be followed by industrial dynamics afterwards. And so both are not happening at the same time, which can explain also the difficulties of some companies to follow the speed at which all things are developing. And I think in the coming months, it's going to be dramatic for a certain number of producers in the top 10, including some Chinese ones.
Concerning the very competitive prices, I think you should make one additional comment on that it's a forward betting, because most of the systems will not be in operation before 2019, 2020. So this also explains some of the price.
Yep. But that's also something very interesting, because some of the bidders still have difficulties to find today extremely competitive module price. So some bets on a price decline that would have been even faster than the one we see for the time being. So we can question how sustainable and reasonable these bids were. But let's see which one will be really built and how.
One more question. You've got people at the door.
You mentioned the share of the centralized PV has been increasing in the last decades. I just want to clarify your LCOE calculations for the parity in the European cities and for Asia Pacific studies. More focused on the distributed PV or centralized PV, or are there cost or supply efficiency difference between these two?
For me, it's totally different. It's totally different. Even the module price is different today for modules that you will install in the residential segment and 100 or 500 megawatts utility scale plants. What we have considered is totally different assumptions. And if you are interested, I can give you the link to the study, to the paper that has been published in EU-PVPS this year that details exactly the assumptions. But we are talking about 2 different worlds, especially residential on one side and utility scale. And the evolution of system price is totally different.
Okay, so thank you for the questions, and I'd like to ask you all to help join me in thanking Gaetan for this great talk.
Thank you.